Morning, everyone. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you this morning. And as part of the encouragement this morning, I want to talk about perspective and our perspective of God, and how having the right perspective of Him and the right perspective of myself will really help us in our faith in God. And the opposite of that is it will really harm us if we don't. And as an introductory story, when I was a student, my first car ever was a Lumo Green City Golf that, being a student, I pretty much ran on fumes most of the time. So I was very, very used to having the fuel gauge in the red, and that's pretty much all I ever had. But I was also, every now and then, I had a situation where that gauge went to the left of the red. I sometimes hoped that it would go all the way around and be full again. But what I did when it was kind of to the left of the red every now and then is I would just change my perspective. I would tilt my head to the left, and when I looked at it from that perspective, the gauge was actually more to the right than it really was, and it just made me feel better, and I would go on driving. And it's obviously just such a foolish thing to do. I could have been stranded on the highway without fuel, and I don't even know if I had a cell phone back then, and so it would have just been a terrible thing. But we can do the same thing in our perspective of God. We can choose to have the wrong perspective, and that can have catastrophic consequences for our faith. And I'd like to look at Job as someone to learn from in this case. And we know when we meet Job, he's a wealthy man. He's got 10 children, and everything is going well for him. And we end up in the heavens where the devil and God is having this conversation. And God is actually boasting about Job to the devil. And we know that the devil then gets free rein to do a couple of things to Job. And so suddenly Job's life just falls apart. Like, he suddenly loses all his belongings. I mean, he had cattle and oxen and donkeys like you cannot believe. All his children die. And so in the space of a day or two, he loses everything. And he does have this amazing response where he's sitting there in sorrow, and he says, I came to this earth naked, naked I'll leave. The Lord gives, He takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And we're going, oh, Job, what a man, But things get worse. And so the devil gets permission to touch his health even. And so when we next see Job, he's sitting on ash. He's got nothing anymore. He's on ash, scraping himself with pieces of pottery. And suddenly he's got 3 friends, or friends in inverted commas, but they start accusing him and saying, Job, look at where you are. The only reason for this could be that you've sinned. And so they start saying a bunch of different things and say, it could have been this, and it could have been that, and you could have done this. And in this process, Job starts defending himself. But what happens when we start defending ourselves is we start losing perspective. And so just here and there, just in little bits, as you read this kind of like deep Hebrew poetry, you see little bits of self-pity and self-righteousness creeping in. And the problem with those two is the word self. And as soon as we start focusing on self, we change our perspective of God. And if anyone could have had self-pity, it's probably Job, And the problem, he doesn't want to feel like he did the wrong thing. Because, I struggle with self-pity if my socks don't match. But he lost perspective. And suddenly, where before God was up here and Job was down here, as Job started getting into self-pity and self-righteousness, as he was explaining himself and how actually God was in the wrong here, Job was in the right, suddenly it changed. And God and Job were now on the same level in Job's eyes. And so this conversation continues, and eventually it comes to an end, and the friends can't convince Job. And they were in the wrong, we know that. But then this interesting thing happens, that God starts speaking to Job. And it says He speaks to Job out of the whirlwind. And He pretty much says, put on your big boy pants, let's talk. You had some questions for me, now I've got some questions for you. And what God does in Job 38 is He starts taking Job through this cosmic tour. He starts talking about creation. He starts talking about the sun rising, the sun setting. He starts talking about storehouses in heaven full of snow, full of hail. He starts talking about the ocean and how there are tides, and he determines where the water goes and where it stops. He talks about animals that people hardly ever see. And what God is doing is saying creation has just this immense complexity that we as humans cannot begin to fathom. There's just no chance we can begin to understand what God is doing. And this is just a normal day for God. A normal day for him is managing the stars, the sun, that creation that we cannot comprehend. He just does it. And so even Job's situation, he does not know what is going on actually. And he really doesn't. I mean, Job never knows. God never tells him about this wager. And so as Job listens to everything that God says, and his perspective changes from they're kind of equal, God takes higher. But more importantly, Job actually is the one who goes lower. And so Job in reply says, I am insignificant. And that is a great place to be. To realize, and in comparison to God, I am insignificant. And he is good. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. He is omnipresent. And I have the privilege of being his son and trusting him completely, irrespective of what he chooses to do and how he does it. He can do it. And so recently, my family and I, we were camping in the Cedarburg, and it was a great privilege. And so we were surrounded by these really majestic mountains and just beautiful silence. And that's a good combo to make you feel really, really small. And so in this time, I was actually just seeing how small I am compared to God's greatness. And at the same time, I've been reading the book of Isaiah, reading through some of those, and really astounded by how impressive God is and how big he is and how he knows everything and how just he is and how loving he is and how he is to be feared. And one night, it was a full moon out. It was incredibly bright, and somehow this bright full moon that was almost like day with these big mountains just was quite overwhelming how small it made me feel. And I was lying in my tent eventually, and I just said to God, I'm actually a little bit terrified of you. And it was such a good place to be in. And paradoxically, in that moment, it was actually the closest I've been to God, I think, in the last 2 months, in this place of actually just being so afraid of him in a good way, because he is so big and I'm insignificant. And so I want to encourage you with 2 things. Go somewhere today, just read Job 38, where God speaks to Job and he asks him a lot of questions. Were you there? Were you there? Were you there? And the answer every time is no. And just put yourself in the right place again. Get the right perspective of where God is and where you are. And then secondly, somewhere during the course of the next 2 days, why don't you go out when it's nighttime? If you're in a flat, hopefully you've got a balcony, and just look up at the night sky. Find a star or two, and don't just look at them, but gaze at them, stare at them. And just think about the fact that that star, like if you were to travel for thousands of years at the speed of light, you wouldn't be able to get to it even. And that God made that. And that he is much, much bigger. And get yourself in the right place again in relation to God. Bless you. Hope you have a wonderful week.